Okay, for our first unit, we will discuss the four types of biological molecules. You might hear the other terms, biomolecules or macromolecules. We will probably be calling them either biological molecules or biomolecules, but macromolecules is also used, especially on the STAR exam. We will first focus on carbohydrates and lipids, and then finish with proteins and nucleic acids. So before we begin talking about carbohydrates, we do need to talk about some important vocabulary terms that are going to come up over the next two PowerPoints. And the first one is monomer. It's a molecule that can be bonded to other identical molecules to form a polymer. So an analogy can be like a Lego. If you have just one Lego piece, that would be considered a monomer because it's just one building block. A polymer is a long molecule consisting of many similar or identical monomers that are linked together. So here we have many Legos put together to create a structure. That's kind of what happens with monomers. A lot of monomers are bonded together to create polymers. So lipids don't technically have any monomers, but carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids do. So when we talk about carbohydrates, they are made up of sugars. And the simple sugars are like glucose, fructose, and galactose. So when these simple sugars are put together and bonded together, they can create these large molecules, and we call those complex carbohydrates. So think of like starches or whole wheat bread, that kind of thing would have these large complex carbohydrates. A simple sugar would just be one of the little sugar units. So carbohydrates are also known as saccharides, and really important here, so you might want to write this down. The monomer for carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide. So mono means one, and saccharide means sugar, so one sugar unit. And here you can see that. When we talk about the polymers for carbohydrates, they can be one of three. So we have a disaccharide, an oligosaccharide, or a polysaccharide. And all of these depending on the prefix. So di means two, so two sugar units, saccharide means sugar unit. Oligosaccharide means a few sugar units, so here we have like 4 sugar units. And poly means many, so we have polysaccharide, and this is our complex carbohydrate. So for the definition of carbohydrates, they're sugars that are produced by plants during photosynthesis, and they are the primary source of energy for most organisms. So when we talk about energy, your cells need energy in order to perform the functions that your cells need to perform to keep you alive. And most of the energy that your cell does acquire or use for these functions comes from carbohydrates. And here we have our chemical equation for photosynthesis, which we will talk about later, but it's always nice to see. So really important, there is glucose. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but carbohydrates provide energy. That's the main thing that they provide. That's their main function. You really want to understand that. Something else that carbohydrates are used for in your cells is they are used in the cell walls of plants and other organisms. So plants are not the only things that have cell walls. But when these sugars are placed together, they can create these large complex carbohydrates like cellulose in plants, and they are very strong and pretty rigid. So here we have a picture of cellulose, and you can see how complex it really is. So lipids are the group of biomolecules that contain fats, cholesterols, and phospholipids. And here we have some cholesterol, some different fats, and some phospholipids. So when we think about lipids, fats are the primary example of them. And fats are made up of a glycerol molecule that is attached to 3 fatty acids. So here we have in green our glycerol molecule, and then we have our 3 fatty acid chains. We can call them chains as well, and they kind of look like tentacles. So lipids can be used to store large amounts of energy, and if your cell, for example, runs out of carbohydrates, what they can do, or your body can do, is break down some of the lipids or fats, and then from there it can get carbohydrates like glucose and things that it needs in order to do any of the cellular processes that it needs to do. So gram for gram, and what does that mean? If I had 10 grams of carbohydrates, 10 grams of lipids, um, the lipid is still going to have more energy just because of the types of bonds and the structure that it does have. So even though, sugar, you might get a quick rush, the lipid is going to probably give you more energy in the long run. But that's not to say that lipids' main function is to give you energy. It's just something that it can do. So when your body stores its energy, it will usually store it in the form of fat because that's kind of like a reserve that it can take little chunks of if it needs to, if it runs out of carbs. But carbs is the main energy source. So the main function of these lipids and the reason we need them in our diet is because they are the primary component of all the cell's membranes. So your cell has a cellular membrane to protect it from the outside world, but it also has a bunch of membranes because of the organelles inside. So it'll have a nuclear membrane, it'll have a membrane around the mitochondria and different things like that, the vacuole. And we'll talk about those different parts of the cell later. But your cells need these lipids in order to create these membranes in your body. And we call those lipids phospholipid molecules. And here we can see an example. So we have our phosphate right here, and then our lipid part with the fatty acid chains. So a really important fact to remember, all 4 classes of biological molecules are considered organic compounds. And the reason they are called organic is because organic has to do with life, or things that are living, or things that are needed in order to survive. Organic is kind of like talking about life. So the reason we call these organic is because they're all based in carbon. So carbon is the main building block of life. It's the element that we all have and we all need. And that's why we call these organic compounds. All of these will have carbon. Okay, so that is our first set of notes. Make sure that you write down all the important information, all the vocabulary terms, and that you have at least 2 or 3 questions ready for tomorrow because we will be answering those questions in class. And I hope you have a good day. Okay.